Hello, I'm Philip Brown. I'm the Secretary of the United Nations Association Coventry branch in the UK. Today is the 12th of May 2020, and the 12th of May is designated by the International Council of Nurses as World Nurses Day. And it's held on this day because it's the anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale. 2020 has also been designated as the International Year of the Nurse and the Midwife by the World Health Organization. And they chose 2020 because it is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale. This International Nurses Day is very appropriate for this year, 2020, when we are in the middle of a global pandemic of COVID-19, which is stretching the world's health services to the limit. And nurses and midwives are key to controlling this pandemic and treating people who have it. And we are just emerging these days, today and this week. Many countries are emerging from a lockdown, which they have been under for several weeks. And that is the reason that we are creating this video in order to share the International Nurses Day with people who might otherwise have been able to meet and celebrate in person. And this video is being created by the website Coventry Teleconference, which was created by Coventry Lord Mayor's Committee for Peace and Reconciliation, so that any group could have a teleconference for up to 100 people, lasting up to 24 hours. So thanks very much to them. I first of all want to share with you some information from the International Council of Nurses about this day. So let me share a screen with you. So this is the website of the International Council of Nurses. The theme for this year is Nurses, Nurses, a Voice to Lead, Nursing the World to Health. And indeed, that's exactly what they are doing. In 2020, the aim of the International Year of the Nurse and the Midwife is to recognise the challenges the world faces in relation to good health and the contribution of nursing in addressing these. And many people in the world are celebrating their nurses by doing public demonstrations to say thank you for the nursing profession and indeed the whole of the medical services in their country. The International Council of Nurses says that nursing is at the core of enabling health systems across the entire world to achieve high quality, accessible and affordable healthcare. And of course, we are especially aware on this day and in this year that many people in the world do not have healthcare which is high quality, accessible or affordable, or indeed have any healthcare at all. So you can read a lot more about the International Council of Nurses on their website. So it is icn.ch. I'm going to start this celebration of nurses by showing you an extract from a video made to introduce this topic, in which the President of the International Council of Nurses, Annette Kennedy, talks to the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros.
you, Dr. Tedros, for taking the time out to speak to us today. I know you have a busy schedule, but this is an important day for us. It's an important day for the nurses of the world. It's the International Nurses Day. It's also the year that she designated in WHO as the year of the nurse and the midwife. It's also the bicentenary of Florence Nightingale. And it's turned out to be a year that's very different to what we anticipated in celebrating. But I'm wondering, what message do you have for the nurses of the world?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Annette. First of all, I would like to say happy International Nurses Day. And I say this as part of the nursing community because, as you know, I am honorary nurse and, of course, midwife. So it's such a great honor. And on behalf of WHO's Chief Nursing Officer, Elizabeth Airo, my colleague, and all my WHO colleagues, I would like to say thank you to the world's nurses for their commitment. I'm sure Florence Nightingale would have been very proud of how the profession has developed since her pioneering work. By the way, this year, when we open our new building, the plan was with you and others to have a statue of her in our new building, and hope when this COVID is behind us, we will do it. And I know Nightingale will be, her statue will be in our building to represent the sacrifice and service of all nurses. And I really look forward to that day when I join you and others to celebrate and put that statue in our new building. It will be an incredible moment. And every year, as you know, nurses provide care, comfort, and treatment to patients in every part of the world. And this year, of course, they face an incredibly demanding situation as they help to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. And International Nurses Day is a time to recognize all that nurses contribute each and every day. I know your Nursing the World to Health report, which is launched today, will provide significant evidence for the importance of investment in nursing, the state of the World Nursing Report. And we would be happy to discuss about that to my sister Annette.
Thank you, Dr. Tedros, and thank you for saying that you are going to have a statue of Florence Nightingale in your building. That will be very much appreciated by all the nurses. And as you know, I'm sure she's wondering why, when she did in about 160 years ago, spoke about hygiene and health promotion, disease prevention in the Crimea War, why we still haven't continued that today, because that's so important. But somewhere we lost our way in that. So yeah, you know, it would be a great idea to have her, and we'd be delighted to come and launch it with you. But as you say, this was a year where we have had a lot of contact. We've had a lot of work, the year of the nurse and the midwife, but we've also had a lot of work over the years with primary health care, with talking about universal health care, talking about non-communicable diseases, elderly care, vaccination, all of those areas we've worked very hard on. I think we were the first NGO to join WHO. But the highlight of this year, certainly for nurses, was the launch of the report on the state of the world's nursing. And we certainly thank you for commissioning that. We worked with you on it, and we are delighted at what the report contains. It gives us a platform for all the health policies recommendations in it. And we're wondering what you see as the importance of it and what you see going forward will help in investing in the health service and investing in nursing.
No, thank you, Annette. ICN has been a valued partner of WHO, as you know, and as you said. and the first one. And I'm really grateful for the support ICN has provided to me and my colleagues. And the Year of the Nurse and Midwife is an important milestone in the history of the professions. It acknowledges their incredible contribution to the world's health, and I hope it will encourage the recruitment of a new generation to carry on the excellent work that nurses and midwives do. The State of the World's Nursing Report is the first document to provide a snapshot of the global nursing workforce. It highlights the scale of the challenge we face, and a shortfall of 6 million nurses is a problem we have to solve. It also provides a roadmap for governments to invest in nursing, to fill that gap and progress towards universal health coverage. So back to you, Annette, but I'm really excited that we have this first report, and from WHO side, in partnership with ICN, we would like to have the State of Nursing annual report, actually, and I hope this will be the start, and but not the end. And I'm really glad that WHO and ICN are actually pathfinders in starting this report, and it will help the world in addressing the challenges, but at the same time using to the max the potential that nurses have to our health systems, especially now during COVID. I think the world will understand the value of our nurses and other health workers, and why we should really take bold measures to prepare our health system and have a strong health system in each and every country. Thank you, Annette, again, and back to you.
I think, Dr. Tedros, if I remember rightly, the first time I met you, you said, without health, we have zero. We have nothing. And I think that's true today. And you're right, and I hope that I've always asked for the fact that after this report that we would monitor the situation on a regular and a yearly basis, and I thank you for saying that we will do that on a yearly basis. And although COVID-19 has cast a shadow across the world, it has made a difference for everybody, everywhere. Things that we took for granted, like going for a walk, like going to work, like going to school, like health, now has become a value. And it's so important that we protect and value the frontline workers, that we ensure, and I know that you and WHO have been aligned with ICN in their thinking of the need to protect the frontline workers with protective equipment and with support for their mental and physical health, and for the need for testing, particularly priority testing with healthcare workers, and collecting the infection rates and the deaths. It is so important that we know that, because that helps us with prevention and it helps us to prepare it. But what more can we do, and how can we show that COVID-19 needs to show the world that we need stronger healthcare systems and that we need to invest in nursing? Because we have seen in various countries throughout the world, we've called for people to come back into work from retirement. We have called for the students to come back into work. So it's obviously we need investment in nursing and in healthcare.
Well, that's about half of that program, or that broadcast, and you can find it on YouTube. Okay, so there were a lot of ideas mentioned there, and Florence Nightingale was mentioned several times. So the reason that today is International Nurses Day is because it's the anniversary of Florence Nightingale's birth. And the reason that this is the International Year of the Nurse and the Midwife is because it's the 200th anniversary of her birth. And what I'm going to do now, hopefully, is to share with you a video produced by, who's this produced by? BBC? Yeah, BBC Teach. So if you search for BBC Teach, Florence Nightingale, you should find it. And this is a dramatisation of the life and work of Florence Nightingale.
Soon we were packed and ready to leave for a war that had until now seemed so far away, in a country most of them had never even heard of. Even I had a little apprehension, not so much for what we might find, but because I knew this was my chance to prove my worth as a nurse. The journey to Scutari in Turkey took several weeks. We arrived, and it was hot. The hospital itself was in the shell of an old army fort close to the battlefield. As we walked towards it, I didn't quite know what we'd find. Whatever we had imagined, this was worse. The first thing to hit you was the smell. The stench of sickness and filth. Soldiers lay on the floor in pools of blood. Undressed wounds were covered in flies. Sheets, such as there were crawling with lice and maggots. It was a hell on earth. I knew in an instant what needed to be done. First, I had to persuade the doctor to let us get to work. I knew what I wanted to do, and I wouldn't let it go. He resisted, but in the end, he said that things had got so bad, he was willing to let me try. Here was my chance to prove what I believed were the first principles of good nursing, cleanliness and hygiene. I set my nurses to cleaning every inch, every crevice, every corner of the place. First, we swept. I believed that when the wounded came to us, they should expect not dirt and disease, but good food and clean sheets and fresh air and the chance for nature to heal their wounds. Then, we scrubbed. That way, we would be in charge, order would prevail, and health could be restored. I wouldn't let my nurses rest until the place was spotless. I was strict with them, and I suspect they found me rather stern. Finally, we brought in fresh sheets. And once clean, the hospital would stay clean. This was how I'd imagined it. clean and hygienic and everything in its place. Now, we could concentrate on tending to the soldiers' wounds and nursing them back to health. The change in the hospital was immediate. I may have been stern with the nurses, but at night, I walked amongst the soldiers on the wards. I would sit with them if they wanted, or read to them, or take their hand if they called out. After all, it was for them that we were there at all, and I so wanted each of them to get better. Because of my lantern and my nightly rounds, they started to call me the Lady of the Lamp. Soon we were rewarded for all our efforts. Soldiers that would have died before were getting better, and some were able to leave their beds. It gave me such satisfaction to watch them leave. I'd never felt more complete. After the war ended, I stayed until every last soldier was well enough to leave. When I got back to England, I was astonished to find that I was famous. Not only were people talking about my work, but there was a trust fund that had been set up in my honour. It was a good deal of money, and I used it to start up the first ever nurses' training school in London. What I did changed nursing for good. It became a real profession with strict principles and standards, and all the better for the health of the entire nation. As a girl, I had decided that I would do something with my life. I'm glad that I took hold of that idea and I never let it go.
So that was the BBC Teach version of what Florence Nightingale achieved. The video is called The Life and Work of Florence Nightingale, brackets, dramatisation, and the subtitle is, or in the series of History, True Stories. Well, we're now going to find out what the real true story is. I'm afraid I have to say that in this case, although I generally trust what the BBC says, that is not the true story. The true story is going to be shown in a very different video. I'm afraid the quality of this is not good. Sorry, the quality of the video is not very high. It's not a high resolution video, but they have some experts talking about people who've written biographies of Florence Nightingale, people who know the true story of what she achieved and what she didn't achieve. And you'll find that the picture is very different from the myth. What we just saw was the myth. Now we're getting the truth. The truth is more interesting, more complicated, but pretty different.
At 32, with an income of £500 a year, Florence was finally free. She had already received some nursing training in Germany. Now she was off to Paris to see how hospitals were run. But it had been in Rome that she'd met the man who would dramatically alter the course of her life, the reformist MP, Sidney Herbert.
Sidney Herbert was a man who was said to have all the cards in his favour. He had good looks, he had riches, he was well educated. But his fatal problem was that he always fell under the thrall of domineering women. And in Florence, he met the ultimate domineering, bossy, ruthless woman.
In 1854, the Crimean War broke out. Sidney Herbert, by now the Minister at War, was about to cast Nightingale in a role that would finally satisfy her sense of purpose. Russia had invaded the Balkans. Britain joined France and Turkey to stop their expansion. The charge of the Light Brigade was only one of the disasters about to befall the British Army.
Men, it was a mad-brained trick, but it was no fault of mine. Go again, sir. No. You have done enough today.
The British, who hadn't really fought a major war since Wellington's time, some 40 years earlier, went to the Crimea thinking it was going to be a short, sharp campaign. They didn't take with them hospitals, they didn't take with them ambulances, they didn't take with them enough for doctors, and they didn't even have nursing sisters. So with the result that when cholera struck, this caused a tremendous disaster to the British Army.
None of this would have mattered were it not for the invention of the war reporter, in particular William Howard Russell of the Times, whose graphic accounts of army incompetence began to appear on breakfast tables around the country.
It is with feelings of surprise and anger that the public will learn that no sufficient preparations have been made for the proper care of the wounded. What will be said when it is known that there is not even linen to make bandages? Not only are surgeons not to be had, but there are no dressers or nurses to carry out the surgeon's directions.
The country was outraged. The government had to act.
Sidney Herbert wants to stop the bad news on the front pages of the newspapers. And he writes to Florence Nightingale and says, would you take a small expedition of nurses out to investigate conditions in the army hospitals? There have never been women nurses in military hospitals unless they were wives of soldiers or prostitutes or people picked up to work on the spot. It's her moment, and she seizes that moment.
On the 21st of October, Florence Nightingale and a band of 38 nurses set sail for Constantinople. Their mission, to care for the thousands of wounded soldiers who were being shipped from the Crimea 300 miles across the Black Sea to the Scutari Barrack Hospital.
She was rather apprehensive because she was relatively inexperienced. She'd never run anything on that scale. She'd certainly never been in a war zone before. And she believed that she was representing the women of Britain, and that if she failed, women would not have another opportunity.
4th of November, 1854. On board the Vectors. We reached Constantinople this morning. We've not yet heard what the military hospital have done for us, nor received our orders. Just starting for Scutari. We are to be housed in the hospital this very afternoon. Everybody very kind. The first wounded I believe to be placed under our care. They are landing them now.
The barracks, which had been borrowed from the Turks, was a massive, gloomy building perched on a cliff overlooking the city. It was supposed to be a flagship hospital. To the soldiers, it was more like a death camp. 2,000 sick and injured men lay along 4 miles of corridor. Their mattresses were 18 inches apart and arranged in 2 rows with barely enough space to walk between them.
What she found in Constantinople was little short of nightmarish. The sick had all been herded into the old cavalry barracks at Scutari. There wasn't enough running water. Disease was rampant.
Cholera, dysentery, diarrheal disease.
Vermin, lice, rats.
Patients without beds, without bedding, without any method of keeping the patients personally clean.
deaths from frostbite, scurvy, pneumonia, the suicide, because there were suicides amongst the soldiers, a small number. Remember that the importance of hygiene was quite unknown at that time. Germs weren't known, bacteria weren't known. It wasn't appreciated that bacteria caused disease, and so nobody took any notice. People didn't wash their hands. Their sanitation was very poor.
Florence and her nurses were shown to the northwest tower of the barracks. Their rooms were infested with rats. The rotting corpse of a Russian officer lay on the floor to greet them.
The medical authorities there were not pleased to see her. They hadn't been warned that she was coming with these nurses. They had no experience of using female nurses, and they told her that they were unable to give her nurses any instructions about what to do in the wards.
They were virtually ostracised, but she realised that if she pushed too hard, she would antagonise matters even more, so she instructed her nurses to do nothing until they were asked by the medical officers to actually carry out nursing duties.
It was a clever strategy. Within days, thousands of casualties from the Battle of Inkerman arrived at the hospital, and the waiting game was over.
Suddenly, Scutari was overwhelmed with badly wounded men from the battlefront, men suffering not just from rifle shots, but also from sword slashes, the kind of open wounds which let sepsis in very quickly.
The doctors can't cope, and that's when she can start actually working and cleaning up as much as they could, making bandages and covering men with blankets.
Nightingale was very concerned with the personal cleanliness of soldiers and the personal cleanliness of the lower orders in general. I think she concentrated primarily upon the person, reflecting the common idea that cleanliness was next to godliness.
But washing soldiers and rolling bandages could not disguise the fact that Scutari was in chaos and the men in charge incompetent. Food was scarce, yet thousands of cabbages were dumped into the sea because the paperwork was incorrect. Scurvy was rife, but lime juice was withheld because no one would authorise its distribution.
What they had at Scutari was an outdated army bureaucracy that couldn't cope with the demands being made on it in terms of supplies, medical supplies, and just ordinary supplies.
Florence believed she should take control.
She constantly fought against the commissariat department to get more food and better supplies, cheating whenever necessary. She broke open a storeroom once because the commissariat said that the stores in it couldn't be issued, and she encouraged her nurses, in fact, to subvert the strict dietary regulations.
She was trying to organise things, and that was what she excelled at. She wasn't actually a very good nurse. Her sister said she was a terrible nurse. Whenever Parthy was ill and Flo had to nurse her, she was awful. But she organised everything.
21st of December, Barrack Hospital, Scutari. Dear Mr. Herbert, this morning I foraged in the purveyor's store, a cruise I make almost daily, as the only way of getting things. No mops, no plates, no forks, no spoons, no scissors for cutting the men's hair, which is literally alive.
She has the ear of the Secretary at War. So she's like a spy, and she is a spy. She, every night after everybody else has gone to bed, she writes a long letter back to Herbert describing in detail and naming names of who is incompetent, and telling him to get rid of these people. So of course they don't trust her. She's a spy.
The military and medical command were also threatened by what they perceived as Nightingale's lack of a feminine sensibility.
One of the things that Florence Nightingale did that tended to irritate many of the surgeons was that she insisted on being present at operations. It appears that she was interested in them technically. You can tell this because she wrote home letters giving quite detailed descriptions, which her family, I may say, found to be revolting, and which they cut out when they copied the letters for circulation to their friends.
In all our corridors, I think we have not an average of 3 limbs per man. One poor fellow, exhausted with hemorrhage, had his leg amputated as a last hope and dies 10 minutes after the surgeons have left him. The surgeons pass on to the next. An excision of the shoulder joint, beautifully performed and going well. Ball lodged just in the head of the joint and fracture starred all round.
One doctor complained to his superiors that she had changed a dressing on a wounded man while his private parts were exposed. And I think this just shows how unfamiliar they were with the concept of female nursing at the time and how they resented this unfamiliar concept.
It was imperative for Nightingale that her nurses' behaviour did not give the medics further excuse to undermine her. She was determined that they would uphold her strict moral regime.
If you have women at night walking the wards for a few shillings, the women could very easily offer sexual services. Everyone in the army is quite sure that the nurses are going to end up in bed with a soldier. They don't want those nurses. And any scandal gives them cause to get rid of the nurses.
Dear Mrs. Herbert, I am so sorry to be obliged to tell you that Thompson and Anderson, 2 of the Presbyterian nurses, went out drinking with an orderly on Saturday night. Anderson was brought back dead drunk. But Thompson I believe to be the most hardened offender. This was such a catastrophe that there was nothing to be done but to pack them off to England directly.
She's unhappy about sex, she's unhappy about drink, but she's most unhappy about insubordination. She wants them to obey her on all occasions.
There were criticisms of Nightingale during the war. In fact, she almost brought a libel case against one nurse who came back to England and started spreading gossip and malicious stories about her. But they were to some extent justified. Florence could only lead. She wasn't interested in delegating.
In a way, she was the archetypal military person. She believed in hierarchy and order, in command. She had been brought up to command, to manage, as most well-educated upper-class women were of her period.
Nightingale was single-minded in her desire to run the hospital. When Sidney Herbert sent a new party of nurses to Scutari, which included a group of Irish nuns led by Mother Mary Bridgman, Florence saw not an ally, but a rival.
They're both of them used to getting their own way. They're both of them competing in a very difficult male world. Florence could have formed a coalition with Bridgman, and given the numbers pouring in after Inkerman, the Battle of Balaclava, they needed every nurse they could get. She didn't do that. She didn't want to share power, and I don't think she could conceive of a coalition. She either had power or would scheme to get it, and certainly would ruthlessly try to keep it.
Nightingale had Bridgman and her nuns banished from the hospital. Many of her rejects went off to the front and turned out to be extremely good nurses. They were bitter about Nightingale's treatment of them. But Florence did endear herself to the troops. For the first time in military history, they had a champion, someone who could see them as more than just cannon fodder.
She was dedicated to the common soldier. I think that's one of the most moving things in the whole story, is that night after night she would sit up with soldiers who were dying. She also wrote hundreds of letters of condolences home to their parents, to their mothers, saying, "Your boy is dead, but he died peacefully and in comfort," which actually was quite often not the whole truth.
Dear Mrs. Hunt, I grieve to be obliged to inform you that your son died in this hospital on Sunday last. His complaint was chronic dysentery. He sank gradually from weakness without much suffering. Everything was done that was possible to keep up his strength. He spoke much of his mother, and you may have the satisfaction of knowing that he had the most constant and careful care. The chaplain and myself saw him every day.
The soldiers wrote glowingly of her in their own letters home, and soon Nightingale was famous throughout Britain.
One of the main reasons why the legend made such an impact was that the men involved in the Crimean War had been such a total washout. There was no Nelson, there was no Wellington. Instead, there was this figure who became a kind of maternal goddess to the soldiers. Of course she wasn't maternal at all, but that kind of image of her suited popular feeling at the time.
At first, the Times newspaper mistakenly referred to Florence as Mrs. Nightingale. When the public discovered that the matron of Scutari was in fact a graceful young lady, it only added to her mystique. Ironically, it was Florence's mother and sister, originally so opposed to her nursing, who took charge of publicity. And the Nightingale PR campaign benefited from a new photographic technique.
What you do get in the mid-1850s is this new process of making small, cheap photographs of celebrities, which were known as carte de visites. They could be produced really quite cheaply on a camera plate. You could go 6, 8 or 10 of them, print them off and sell them cheaply. The images themselves are very straightforward. They don't tell you very much about Florence. They're not sort of heavy-duty, iconic images. It's the sheer number of them, their availability of them, which is a measure of her fame and celebrity.
The publicity generated by her meant that all the women of Britain were sitting knitting socks and mufflers, and children were being brought up to do things for the poor soldiers of the East. And indeed, Queen Victoria herself asked everyone to pray and to do their bit. So there was a huge national resource being harnessed as a result of the Lady of the Lamp.
But despite her sanctification at home and some improvements at the barracks, death was everywhere during Nightingale's first winter at Scutari. Between November 1854 and March 1855, 4,077 soldiers died, 10 times more from illnesses such as typhus, typhoid, dysentery and cholera than from battle wounds. Nightingale blamed the officials for not sending supplies and the military commanders for sending men to Scutari in a wretched condition.
The worst month was January, 2 months after Florence Nightingale arrived, when of the 6 soldiers who came into Florence Nightingale's hospital at Scutari in that month, half never came out again. If I take a particular regiment as an example, the Grenadier Guards, in the 7-month period covering the first winter, they sent 300 patients to the hospital. The statistics seem to show that none of them came back. You would be better off in the regimental hospital tent at the front than you would be being sent to Scutari.
At home, there was an emergency debate in Parliament over the treatment of the soldiers. The government fell, and Sidney Herbert was forced to resign as Minister at War. Lord Palmerston, the new Prime Minister, was convinced that inadequate building sanitation had something to do with the high death rate.
Palmerston had been in the previous government, and he was a known, convinced public health enthusiast. The very first thing he did was to send out a sanitary commission of civilian public health experts to clean up the hospitals and the camps.
When they arrived at Scutari in March 1855, the commissioners discovered that the hospital had been built on a contaminated cesspit. The sick and wounded were wading through and drinking their own sewage. The overcrowded wards were airless and full of rats. They immediately cleaned out the vermin and reduced the overcrowding. They bored holes in the ceiling to improve ventilation and arranged for the sewers to be flushed out.
They're concerned with environmental improvements, whereas Nightingale had been concerned almost solely with personal cleanliness. And this is the big difference, and this is why the Sanitary Commission are successful in reducing disease, whereas Nightingale's measures had no impact whatsoever, and indeed actually were accompanied by an increase in sickness.
No one can adequately explain why it never occurred to Nightingale that sanitation may have been a problem. After all, she moved in the kind of circles which were familiar with new thinking on public health. It was only later that she would come to realise the significance of the Commissioner's work. At that time, Nightingale appeared to be far more concerned with extending her power base than the work of the Commissioners. She set off for the Crimea in an attempt to take charge of the nursing operations in the front-line hospitals. Within days, she was stricken with a severe fever.
Nobody quite knows what this illness comprised. They cut her hair off, which is normal to do with a woman who has fever. She might have had typhus. She might simply have had exhaustion.
Now it's believed she probably caught a rather less common disease called brucellosis. And brucellosis is another infectious disease, very uncommon in this country, but not uncommon in some of those countries in hot climates. And that's probably what she had.
The Crimean War ended in the spring of 1856. Nightingale waited for the final soldier to be discharged from Scutari before she began her journey home. She arrived at the local railway station near her parents' house in Derbyshire, unannounced.
I think it was very difficult when Florence came back from the Crimea. What was she coming back to? All that lay before her was the role of a dutiful daughter. Back to Embley, back to Lea Hurst, back to living with Mum and Parthy. The one thing she knew, and I think was certain about, was that she was not going to be sucked back into that life. She had changed tremendously as a result of her time in the Crimea at Scutari.
While her parents were happy to flaunt their daughter's celebrity, Nightingale shunned the attention. She was now consumed with anger about the war.
She was indignant at the injustice that had been done to the common soldier in the Scutari. These were some of the bravest soldiers that England had ever known. They'd won extraordinary victories against the Russians during the war, and they'd been allowed to perish, she thought, because of the negligence of the senior frontline army officers.
Nightingale put pressure on the government to set up a royal commission on the health of the army, and in 1857 the commission began taking evidence. She prepared her report, convinced it would expose the incompetence of the military command.
During that time, she focused on the data that had come back from the Crimea, and she analysed it in cooperation with some of the best scientific brains in England at the time. And quite an extraordinary thing happened. She changed her mind entirely on what had caused the deaths of those men in hospital. She decided that it was the hospitals themselves, the state of the hospitals themselves, that was responsible for those men's deaths. They had been very sick when they came to the hospital, but if the hospitals had been hygienic, they could easily have recovered, nearly all of them.
In fact, the statistics showed that the death toll at Nightingale's hospital had been higher than at any other, including those at the front.
Until sanitation improved, all that one can say Florence Nightingale was doing was helping soldiers to die in more comfortable, happier circumstances. And that's a very shocking fact for people who've been brought up on the legend that she went out there and made everything perfectly all right.
When Florence Nightingale discovered that she had been wrong about the cause of the patient's death in her hospital, she was determined to lay the blame for this scandal at somebody's door. She stopped blaming the army, she stopped blaming the doctors, and she started to blame the government. And she started particularly to blame her former friend, the ex-cabinet minister, Sidney Herbert, who had been responsible for selecting hospital locations. The fact is, it's in black and white that she wrote to Herbert blaming him for the whole catastrophe. Did she blame herself as Sidney Herbert's troubleshooter? It's difficult to know what goes on in a person's mind. But it is noticeable that her pride at having done what she'd done, which she expressed in various ways when she first came back from the war, evaporated. And from then on, she never speaks with any degree of pride of anything that she did during the Crimean War.
Three months after presenting her report to the Commission, Florence Nightingale had a nervous breakdown. She took to her bed for the next 11 years.
She became a recluse in the sense that she didn't enter into normal social activities. She didn't go out, she didn't go to other people's houses. She was confined to South Street, which was her house in London. She didn't go to Embley or Lea Hurst. Her dealings with her family and friends were filtered.
The bustle of visitors irritated her. So people tend to call at her house and wait in the downstairs room and send up their instructions by writing, and then she would write a note and send them down, and business would be done in that way. There definitely was a physical root to her illness. After all, she'd almost died in 1855, and she almost died in 1857. But also, she was quite clever because she used her illness to her own ends. If she didn't want to see somebody, especially her mother and her sister, then she would claim to be ill.
Nightingale devoted her bedridden years to the cause of public sanitation. She seemed unable to forgive herself for failing to make the obvious link between the sanitary conditions at Scutari and the death rate there. With phenomenal energy, she spearheaded a mass of radical and often controversial reforms. Army welfare, workhouse reform, the training of nurses. She even advised on the design of hospitals such as St Thomas's in London. And for most of this, she used Sidney Herbert as her front man.
She was virtually a cabinet minister in all but name. There were certain areas of government action that could not be carried out without running the proposals past Miss Nightingale. In at least one famous occasion, she had power of appointment to the cabinet. She objected to a candidate that was chosen by Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, and approved by the Queen. She said, no, he's not the right man, here's my candidate, and her candidate was put in his place.
She was as controlling as ever. Everything had to be done according to her rules. Doubts and frailty would not be tolerated.
You only have to look at her treatment of Sidney Herbert as he was dying, quite clearly dying, in 1861. She was pushing him on and on and on. He said he had headaches, he had weakness, he couldn't get out of bed. She didn't care. This was a man who'd been a close friend of hers for 15 years, who had launched her career. But she pushed him to the limits of his endurance, and finally he died.
As her friends in Parliament began to lose power, Nightingale's political influence started to wane. She re-established links with her family, spending more time with her mother and visiting her sister Parthenope. She was now in her 60s and had lost her radical edge. When nurses around the country demanded professional registration, she campaigned against them. She even doubted the cause of women's suffrage.
Women's suffrage, she was ambivalent. She realised that in public she had to be seen more or less to support it because that was what advanced women were doing. Privately, she thought that women were rather silly and wouldn't make much difference. In fact, she didn't have much of an opinion of women. And in the end, she puts her signature to the great petition against women's suffrage in the late 1880s.
She identified with men, and in fact, throughout her career, you can see her reacting very strongly against women. She really disliked women. She said, "I am brutally indifferent to the rights and wrongs of my sex." And it's true that throughout her life, she relied much more on men, was much more interested in men, thought of herself as a man, and had really almost total contempt for the rest of the female race.
Istanbul is redolent with memories of Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War, and Mrs. Thatcher made a pilgrimage to the British military cemetery here.
She was just one of the great people of history who had an idea, who had a dedication, who knew what she wanted to do and wasn't going to be put off by any generals or anyone else.
In later life, she was able to develop friendships with women, and once again you see the same kind of intense affection for young women which had predominated in her earlier years. I mean, there are some rather excruciating letters that she sent to young nurses. "Dear baby goddess, dear Pearl." It was an extraordinary softening of a woman who had been quite hard and metallic in her maturity.
At the age of 87, Florence was presented with the Order of Merit, the first woman in history to receive the honour. She was now officially confirmed as one of the truly legendary Victorians.
What Florence Nightingale should be famous for now is for her provision of political leadership for the public health movement in the 50 years after the Crimean War. Her embarrassingly anti-establishment views have been hidden up to now behind this sentimental picture of the wartime nurse.
In 1918, Lytton Strachey wrote his famous debunking attack on the Victorians, in which he described the real Miss Nightingale as being more interesting than the legendary one, but also less agreeable. And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
This is the only recording of Florence Nightingale's voice, made by Edison in 1890.
I am so younger, even as memory, just as days. I hope my voice may perpetuate the great work of my life. God bless my dear old comrade of Balaclava, Florence Nightingale.
In her will, she says, "I do not want a funeral in Westminster Abbey. I don't want to be buried in Westminster Abbey. I don't want anything special done for me. I want the plainest, simplest funeral, and I want enlisted men to carry my coffin and to be buried in the family plot." And this is what happens. She has a funeral in which maybe less than 50 people come to. And she's buried in the simplest Victorian monument that just says FN 1820-1910. It's very moving, very, very simple ending to this remarkable life.
I think that is remarkable. I think that the real story is far more interesting than Well, the legend of the woman with the lamp, the lady with the lamp, doesn't really tell you anything, does it? Her real achievement, it looks like, is campaigning for hospital hygiene and the building of good quality hospitals, which, well, I mean, I suppose, yeah, encouraging or starting having women nurses was important too. Both of those things were important. But obviously a very complicated woman. So I think that was worth watching. So we're back to her birthday, her 200th, and the 200th anniversary of her birthday. And the next video that I'd like to show you talks about how we train student nurses today. Oh, shush. Right, so this is a video, again on YouTube, published by a group called Extraordinary People. And this is Student Nurses, episode 1. And there are other episodes in the series, but we will just watch the first episode. So this is about student nurses. Obviously very important people. And we found out in that previous video, I don't know when that was made, there is a shortfall of 6 million nurses.
Training to be a nurse has changed dramatically since the early days of the NHS.
Gentlemen need a DC car diversion.
You've just spoken a foreign language to me there.
Greater demands and added responsibility
Short, sharp, scratch.
make it harder to qualify than ever before.
I'm just doing assignment after assignment after assignment.
We follow students in Birmingham and Manchester,
I want to listen to your chest.
juggling academic study
Nothing's going in.
with home life and work on the wards.
You're never going to learn how to be a nurse until you're out there doing the nursing job.
This time,
Keep yourself calm, all right.
mounting pressure,
Well, you've got a herd of elephants in there right now.
a testing youngster, and first day nerves.
I might walk in there, start crying my eyes out and walk out. I'm not sure yet.
As our nurses-to-be step up to the challenge of 21st century nursing. Only a quarter of practicing NHS nurses have a university degree, but that number is set to change. At unis all over the country, a very different generation of nurses is being born.
So this is what we're looking at today, the renal system.
24-year-old first-year Alistair is among the growing number of men taking on the challenge.
Bricking it. I'm scared. I'm pretty scared, to be honest. I'm not used to being around so many women all the time.
You all right? Yeah.
It's a world away from the job he was trained up to do by his dad.
Proud of him, really. But don't tell him.
He's swapping a hefty paycheck for a different kind of reward.
You won't save lives fitting carpets, but if I can save one life being a nurse, then what an achievement that is in life.
After 2 months in the classroom, Alistair is about to set foot on the ward for the very first time.
worrying most about just how I react to, you know, seeing people in such poor condition, or, you know, people who really seriously need help. I've never seen it before, so I think it'll be quite a shock to the system. I'm starting to get a bit nervous now, actually. See, I think I've come wrong way. I think I've got to get in a lift down here. I'm scared, to be honest. Just lifting for feet at you, so I can't get in that.
First challenge overcome. Alistair's found the orthopaedic ward and staff nurse James.
This is Bay 1. This is where we'll be working today. Numbered bed 1 through to 7. Kitchen. You found the kitchen. Find yourself some cups. Find yourself a brew. Right. That's the important bit. Used to be the bathroom. It's now a stock room. Hoists and traction equipment in here.
It's time for Alistair to get to work.
A lot to take in.
Yeah.
So don't get lost.
Right, okay.
Okay.
There you are. Yeah? Oh, yes, that's me. That's me. No. What? Yeah.
Second year Danny is picking up on a career she first began training for 3 decades ago.
When I started at 19, I was nothing like I was now. I was shy. I wouldn't have said boo to a goose.
Danny's first shot at nursing was cut short by illness, but her teenage desire stayed with her.
I've always wanted to do it. I started it and couldn't complete it, and it never left. It never left. 30 years later, for it to come full circle, I just can't believe that, you know. Gosh, I'm going to make me cry now. Yeah, I am. Yeah, I can't believe that I'm back doing what I started.
Danny's chosen adult nursing for her degree. Today, she faces a gruelling 12-hour shift on the fast-paced acute medical unit in Good Hope Hospital.
It's a bit calm, but you know what, a calm comes before.
She hopes to impress her mentor, staff nurse Helen. It's a far cry from the admin jobs Danny's had before.
I've done lots of office jobs and change, but this is so different. You're more responsible for other people. It's not like, you know, if I make a mistake on the computer, it's going to, you know, affect somebody's life.
Midway through Danny's shift, a seriously ill patient arrives from A&E.
Just bear with me, Hilda.
85-year-old Hilda's heart rate is dangerously high and her breathing painfully laboured.
We've just got to monitor her heart rate at the moment because it's not in normal rhythm.
Just like as if my bra's cutting me really tight underneath.
You just keep yourself calm, all right?
I mean, I'm in you underneath and it's just digging into me.
It's going so fat, yeah. Well, you've got a herd of elephants in there right now.
Hilda's condition is deteriorating. They need the crash trolley on hand in case she suffers a cardiac arrest.
What goes through your head is like, am I going to be able to fulfil the training that you've, you know what I mean, if you need to do the CPR and that, if that emergency happens, are you able to react to it? You know, it's a bit different doing it in uni as to doing it when it happens. Just make sure that's accessible, please. It's the crash I want, the crash.
Danny is told to keep a close eye on her patient. Monitoring her symptoms is crucial to assessing Hilda's condition. It's Danny's first major test on the ward.
You're just worried that you're not going to be a hindrance on the ward. You want to go in, seem like you've got some kind of confidence in what you can do, but I hadn't really.
In Manchester, 21-year-old Helen is nearing the end of her 3-year degree. By the time she finishes, she'll have clocked up 2,300 hours of study, and the same again on the wards.
When I started, maybe I was a little bit naive to how much work there was, but now I definitely know. I think the work-life balance has kind of gone out the window, and I am doing a lot more work than life, if you know what I mean. But I know at the end it's for a good cause.
Helen is just one term away from fulfilling her childhood dream of becoming a children's nurse.
At school, my answer was always, I want to be a nurse. Obviously, I think I probably wanted to be a princess or something like that, but it's quite nice now that I am nearly there and I've only got that one last little step to take before I actually am a nurse, and the nurse that I've wanted to be, like, the whole of my life. At the moment, I'm not scared. Ask me in 6 months' time when I start a job.
Like all student nurses, Helen's time is divided between theoretical study and hands-on training. On the children's unit at Salford Royal, she's under the watchful eye of staff nurse Katie. Her first patient is 6-month-old baby Caius.
Hey, Mum. Hi, I'm Katie. This is Helen. She's one of our students. How can we help you?
It's really hot. It's just getting hot. And there's like some spots come up on the bottom of his back.
Okay, I'll just do his temperature first. Huh?
The nurse's immediate concern is the killer disease meningitis.
38.9. Some parents, as soon as they see a rash, they link it straight to meningitis, so we tend to get quite a few patients in who come in with rashes, especially young babies, because the parents just want to get them checked out really just to be safe.
And when you press it and then it goes away, it's called a blanching rash, which they are. Okay, so that's a good sign. Okay, it's the rashes that don't go away that we worry about. Okay, but we'll send you up to the Panda unit and one of the doctors will see you up there. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Hello, Panda staff nurse.
Meningitis has been ruled out. To help diagnose his illness, Helen needs a urine sample from baby Caius. Easier said than done.
Sometimes when you take the nappy off and you know the cold air hits it, that makes them. We only need a bit, so even if, you know, if he starts weaning, it goes all over, just try and grab as much as you can. Don't worry if you don't get it all. Okey-doke. Once he's had a wee, we'll put the sample in a little pot and then we'll just test it with urine strips, just to see if anything's in it, really, any protein, any blood, anything that's not meant to be there. So we'll see once he's had a wee. Has he weed? Has he? It's fine, as long as you...
She didn't get in after all that.
Right, let me...
There's a little tiny bit.
I think it's really important to be able to interact with the parents by having a little bit of a laugh with them. It shows them that you are human and you're not just a nurse and you're not like a bit of a robot.
I can't imagine too much.
There you go. Not too much now, come on. Don't be getting greedy. There you go, pop it now. I should know, as a third-year student experiencing babies and how active they can be, that I shouldn't have left it there because I should have knew that I'd kick it over. So I know what, actually, I think that's going to be enough. Right, I'm moving it well away from your foot, mate. I would never class it as a mistake, I'd just class it as like a bit of a learning curve, I suppose. But yeah, I'll never do that again.
Caius's hard-won sample was clear, and with his temperature back to normal, he was later discharged. At the Royal Bolton, former carpet fitter Alistair is about to get to grips with his first ever patient. Raymond needs a bed bath.
I know I'll be scared. I'm going to go in there, you know, with a level head and just try and make the most of, you know, my first experience. And I feel personally I've got a lot to prove because the majority of the cohort have got a lot of experience in healthcare.
Can you just lean forward a little bit while we just get your t-shirt off up your mat? There you go.
There we go.
Over your head.
Yeah.
That's it.
Underneath the arm.
Underneath.
Oh, grand. A bit more vigorous than that.
Yeah. Just let me know if I'm hurting you. I didn't want to do anything wrong, or, you know, I didn't want to hurt him. You do your clinical skills lessons, but when it's in practice, it's totally different. Just do under there. We've actually got moving patients who talk and have feelings and things like that, so it's a bit strange to get used to, I suppose, but it's not for my ego, I'm here to care for them now, so I'm trying my best.
So there's just a little glimpse of student nurses, and that's episode 1, and there are 5 episodes. So if you go to YouTube and look for Extraordinary People, you'll find those. Okay, so that's my little tribute to nurses and to Florence Nightingale, without whom maybe we would not have had clean hospitals and women nurses. So thank you for watching, and have a good day. Have a good International Nurses Day, and have a good 2020 year of the nurse and the midwife. We haven't talked about midwives, actually. But hey-ho. Thank you. Bye.